In the winter haze of the Pacific, Japanese admirals watched the impossible unfold. The U.S. battleships they believed buried at Pearl Harbor were sailing straight toward them, heavily scarred, relentlessly restored, and now hungering for retribution. What followed would shatter Japan's wartime confidence forever. Before dawn on December 7, 1941, as the Imperial Japanese strike force sailed under a cold Pacific sky, the mood aboard the carriers was a taut wire of expectation. From the flagship Akagi, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto awaited confirmation of a plan he had crafted with mathematical precision and political dread. He had warned Tokyo's leadership that Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but not win a prolonged war against the United States. Yet now, as the final attack waves banked over the horizon toward Oahu, even he could not deny the quiet conviction rippling through the fleet. If this blow landed correctly, if the American battleship line was shattered, the Pacific might belong to Japan. The first coded radiogram crackled through just after 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time. Tora, 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 the signal of complete surprise. On Yamamoto's deck, officers bent over the message with electric disbelief. The second wave's report soon followed: Arizona erupting in a geyser of flame, Oklahoma capsizing, West Virginia sinking at her moorings. 8 U.S. battleships damaged or sinking into the mud of Pearl Harbor. Japan's naval commanders believed that at least 5 were gone forever. To the men aboard the carriers, it felt like history snapping into place. For decades, they had studied America's Pacific Fleet as the immovable cornerstone of U.S. power. Now, in a single morning, that cornerstone seemed pulverized. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's staff pored over the early assessments and concluded that the battleship was a relic, a hulking target destined for obsolescence in an age ruled by naval aviation. "America cannot rebuild them in time," one officer remarked, echoing a growing belief across the strike force. If the United States hoped to contest the Pacific, it would have to do so without its armored giants. But the truth unfolding below the smoke-choked sky above Oahu was more complicated and far more dangerous for Japan. Amid the burning debris, stunned American sailors waded through oil-slicked water, searching for survivors beneath twisted steel. They had watched their ships explode, fracture, and slip beneath the surface, symbols of national pride reduced to tombs. Yet among the wreckage came something Japan had not accounted for: a steel hardening of resolve. Men who had escaped the inferno swore that if those battleships ever rose again, the reckoning would be terrible. And quietly, beneath the blackened waters, U.S. naval engineers were already calculating what would be required to salvage them. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Navy celebrated what it believed was a decisive victory, but in its triumph lay the seed of a fatal misunderstanding. Yamamoto knew it. Nagumo suspected it too. Pearl Harbor had not destroyed American will, it had awakened it. And as the smoke drifted off Oahu and the ruined battleships settled into the harbor floor, the United States began the long, methodical process of turning its grief into the force that would one day come roaring back across the Pacific. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy yard at Pearl Harbor transformed into something the Japanese High Command never imagined: a colossal forge of uninterrupted labor. More than 20,000 workers, welders, divers, electricians, riggers, machinists, moved across the shattered harbor like an industrial army. They worked in rotating shifts, day and night, 7 days a week, under floodlights that turned the wrecked battleships into stark silhouettes of twisted steel. What the world saw as devastation, they saw as a blueprint for resurrection. The battleships that Japan believed were gone forever began their improbable return one by one. Nevada, run aground intentionally during the attack, became the first major test. Divers sealed torpedo holes larger than automobiles, welding underwater in near-zero visibility as oil clouds floated around them. Pumps forced out thousands of tons of seawater while engineers stabilized ruptured bulkheads. By February 1942, The ship they had expected to scrap rose free again, scarred but alive. Further down the harbor lay the West Virginia, sitting upright but gutted by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Many in Japan assumed she was a total loss, yet American crews refused the idea. They began the painstaking work of clearing debris deck by deck, cataloging structural damage, and patching her underwater wounds with steel cofferdams. When she was finally refloated in May 1942, her reappearance stunned naval analysts. What Tokyo dismissed as impossible had already begun. California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania entered similar phases of reconstruction, each ship requiring its own unique form of engineering triage. Some needed their electrical grids completely rebuilt. Others demanded new armor belts, new internal subdivisions, new propulsion components. What emerged from the Navy Yard was not merely repair, it was transformation. By mid-1942, many of these battleships received state-of-the-art radar suites, systems the Japanese had not expected the Americans to deploy so rapidly. Fire control upgrades, improved anti-aircraft batteries, modernized superstructures, and reinforced hulls defined the new generation of U.S. capital ships. Japan had attacked an older fleet. What would return to the Pacific was something altogether different. Inside the journals and letters of the workers, a common thread appeared. Welders wrote that every plate they hammered into place felt like a personal vow. Divers recalled the eerie quiet inside the sunken hulls, describing how they worked with the memory of fallen sailors always present. Engineers spoke of exhaustion, but also pride, knowing that each regained volt of power, each sealed bulkhead, brought the fleet one step closer to retribution. By the end of 1943, the effect was unmistakable. Engines that had been silent since the morning of December 7th thundered back to life. Harbor announcers marked the moment American radio crews had long awaited. The battle fleet was sailing again, stronger, faster, and more heavily armed than before. Across the Pacific, Japanese reconnaissance planes began reporting the unthinkable. U.S. battleships once listed as destroyed were returning to the operational order of battle. In Tokyo's naval circles, disbelief spread quietly. The blow that was meant to cripple America had instead triggered an industrial storm no one in the Imperial Navy had fully understood. By mid-1943, faint echoes of a shift in Pacific power began to surface, first in the frigid waters of the Aleutians. As the United States moved to reclaim Attu and Kiska, 2 familiar silhouettes appeared on the horizon, the battleships Colorado and Maryland, both damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor, now fully restored. Their 16-inch guns opened fire on Japanese positions with a precision and intensity that stunned observers. For Japan's northern garrisons, the bombardments were the first undeniable sign that the American capital ships they had expected to remain buried in the mud of Oahu were returning to war. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was the first tremor of a tectonic shift. Through late 1943 and into 1944, the pace of American resurgence accelerated. The rebuilt battleships joined ever-growing task groups sweeping across the central Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, driving into Japanese-held territory with a momentum unmatched earlier in the war. Radar-directed gunnery, newly integrated fire control systems, and reinforced anti-aircraft batteries gave these resurrected ships capabilities far superior to their pre-war forms. Japan's own naval intelligence, reviewing U.S. fleet compositions, began noting with increasing alarm the reappearance of vessels previously listed as destroyed. By June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, this transformation became undeniable. The American fleet, now a technologically modernized fighting force, shattered the attacking Japanese air groups in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Carrier aviation dominated the battle, but beneath that aerial fury, the U.S. battle line surged westward, armored, radar-equipped, and operating with a cohesion that Japan had not anticipated. Japanese post-battle assessments, repeatedly commented on the improved coordination of American surface forces and the unexpectedly high accuracy of their gunnery. The psychological impact deepened as nighttime engagements grew more frequent. Japanese surface commanders had long considered themselves masters of night combat, relying on optics, practice drill, and the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedo. But the Americans brought something new into the darkness: radar-directed fire control. Battleships such as Washington, South Dakota, and later, the rebuilt Pearl Harbor veterans demonstrated an ability to track and strike targets well before visual contact, sometimes firing accurately through darkness, smoke, and weather the Japanese believed would conceal them. Japanese logs and action reports from this period reflect a growing unease, acknowledging that American battleships were operating with a technological edge Japan could not match. For many U.S. sailors, the return to combat carried a deeply personal weight. Men who had survived the inferno at Pearl Harbor now stood on the decks of the very ships that had once settled to the harbor floor. They served the guns that had been silent on December 7th, now restored, recalibrated, and firing again. Engineering teams who had worked around the clock to resurrect these vessels watched from shore stations as the battleships steamed west, knowing that the steel they had shaped was now part of a campaign sweeping across the Pacific. By the autumn of 1944, the stage was set for the next great turning point, Leyte Gulf. As U.S. forces prepared to invade the Philippines, intelligence reports landed on desks in Tokyo that chilled senior officers. The American battle line approaching the archipelago included multiple ships once believed destroyed at Pearl Harbor, battleships Japanese planners had ruled out of the war entirely. The realization carried a heavy silence. The Imperial Navy had not merely misjudged American industrial strength. It had misread the determination of a nation that had rebuilt its fleet with purpose, speed, and unwavering resolve. Ahead lay one of the largest naval battles in history, and the moment when the resurrected American dreadnoughts would meet the remnants of the fleet that had once struck them down. In the early hours of October 25, 1944, the waters of Surigao Strait lay in near-total darkness, an ink-black corridor framed by the islands of the central Philippines. Only the faint glow of burning villages from earlier airstrikes flickered on the horizon. Beneath the surface, long trails of phosphorescence marked the wakes of American PT boats and destroyers weaving into position. Above deck, radar operators studied their scopes with the calm intensity of surgeons. The battle that was coming would be unlike any other in naval history. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force moved northward in a tight column. The battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, cruiser Megami, and their escorting destroyers. Their mission was to break through the strait and attack U.S. invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. What they could not see, what their optics could not detect, was that they were sailing into the oldest battle tactic in naval warfare, now reborn through American electronics: a perfectly prepared, radar-directed crossing of the T. Ahead of them waited a line of U.S. battleships, many of which Japan had once written off as dead. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, all damaged or sunk during the attack on Pearl Harbor, were now arrayed in a straight battle line under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Their hulls were rebuilt, their superstructures redesigned, their fire control systems modernized. At their center, advanced radar gave them a power the Imperial Navy still lacked: the ability to fight with full accuracy in the night. As the Japanese column advanced, American destroyers launched torpedo attacks that shattered Nishimura's formation. The chaos forced Yamashiro to continue alone, steaming directly toward the waiting U.S. battle line. On West Virginia, radar operators tracked her approach with a precision unthinkable just 3 years earlier, when she had a flawless firing solution. Approximately 22,800 yards, West Virginia opened fire with her 16-inch guns. 96 heavy shells would leave her barrels in the minutes that followed, guided by electronic calculation rather than the guesswork of visual range-finding. One by one, the other American battleships joined in. For the first time in history, battleships salvaged from the bottom of Pearl Harbor were firing in unison in a decisive surface action. The symbolism was unmistakable. The ships Japan had once considered destroyed were now delivering the most technologically advanced gunnery ever seen in a battleship engagement. In Tokyo months later, surviving officers studying the battle's reports noted with stunned clarity how completely their assumptions had failed. U.S. radar had rendered Japan's traditional advantages in night fighting obsolete. American industrial effort had resurrected an entire battle line thought permanently lost, and the Imperial Navy's long-held belief that the Pearl Harbor attack had broken American strength was proven catastrophically wrong. By dawn, Nishimura's force was annihilated. Yamashiro sank with most of her crew. Megami was crippled. The strait, once dark and silent, churned with burning oil and drifting debris. Surigao Strait became the final battleship-versus-battleship engagement in history, and the moment Japan was forced to confront the full consequences of its greatest miscalculation. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor had returned, and in the thunder of American broadsides, the Empire's fate echoed across the Pacific. In the days after the Surigao Strait, fragments of battle reports moved slowly through the corridors of the Imperial Japanese Navy's headquarters. Many officers read them in silence, lingering on the names of ships they had once crossed off their threat assessments. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Vessels the Empire believed destroyed in 1940, one now stood recorded at the heart of the battle line that shattered Nishimura's force. The phrasing in several internal summaries was unmistakable. The American battleships are reborn stronger than before. For Japan's surviving admirals, the realization was not merely tactical, it was existential. During post-war interrogations, Admiral Shidru Fukudome reflected on the miscalculation that lay at the heart of Japan's strategy. He explained that Japanese planners assumed America's battleships would need many years to rebuild. The United States, they believed, would be unable to replace its shattered capital ships quickly enough to influence the early and middle stages of the Pacific War. "We underestimated their industry," Fukudome later admitted, "and their spirit." It was a quiet acknowledgement of a failure that had shaped the entire course of the conflict. By 1945, the consequences of that miscalculation were on full display. The resurrected battleships, now fully modernized, radar-equipped, and integrated into massive joint task force operations, pounded Iwo Jima and Okinawa with relentless bombardments. Their heavy guns flattened entrenched positions, cleared beachheads, and supported some of the bloodiest land battles of the war. When the fleet advanced toward Japan itself, these same ships shelled coastal defenses and industrial sites, announcing their presence on the Empire's doorstep with thunderous broadsides. For many American sailors who had survived Pearl Harbor, the journey carried profound symbolism. Men who had watched their ships burn in the waters of Oahu now stood on the decks of those same vessels as they steamed past regions once dominated by the Imperial Navy. The memory of December 7th traveled with them, etched into steel, reinforced through years of reconstruction, and carried forward in every operation that pushed Japan back toward its home islands. Japan had hoped to end the American battleship era in a single devastating strike. Instead, the attack resurrected it. The ships that rose from the bottom of Pearl Harbor became emblems of a larger truth. America's industrial power, once awakened, could not be broken. And as those battleships returned to the Pacific War, they carried more than steel. They carried the memory of a morning that changed the world, and the fury of a nation that refused to stay sunk.